The first blow landed not with fists but with paper, thick white sheets stuffed into an envelope, slapped onto my porch with Karen's manicured hand scrawled across it in red ink. Notice of HOA lawsuit. I stared at the words, dumbfounded, my wife gasping behind me as though she had just seen a ghost. The accusation was almost laughable, failure to comply with HOA regulations. Only, there was one glaring problem. My property wasn't even in her HOA. We had bought our land precisely because it sat one block outside their borders, a little slice of freedom carved out from the grasp of their endless rules. And yet here she was, obese and bloated with power, smirking from the sidewalk like a conquering queen. You thought you could sneak around us, she called out loud enough for the neighbors to hear. But you belong to this community, and no one escapes my rules. The shock rippled through me like an electric current. My wife grabbed the papers, scanning them, her voice trembling with disbelief. She's suing us for not trimming hedges to code, for driveway stains, for mailbox color. She looked up, her eyes wide. But none of this applies to us. Karen laughed, loud and shrill, her belly jiggling with the sound. That's where you're wrong. Everyone within view of my HOA is subject to it. You live here, you obey. That's how order is kept. My blood boiled. I wanted to scream, to rip the papers in half and throw them back in her smug face. But rage wouldn't win this war. Truth would. I went inside, sat at my desk, and pulled out the folder I had kept since the day I bought this house, the county plat maps, the deed history, the very documents that made it clear. My property was sovereign, never annexed, never bound to any HOA. And tucked inside, notarized and sealed, was the final judgment from a boundary dispute decades earlier, which explicitly declared our lot independent. She thought she could bully us into submission with paper? I had paper that cut sharper than any blade. The next day at the courthouse, the scene looked almost theatrical. Karen strutted in, her army of board members trailing like obedient ducklings. She was dressed in garish pearls and a floral blouse that strained against her frame, her voice booming as she announced to anyone within earshot, "Today we show the neighborhood what happens to freeloaders." My wife squeezed my hand, fear flickering in her eyes, but I gave her a small smile. I knew what was coming. When the judge entered and the case was called, Karen launched into a tirade, waving her manicured fingers as she described me as a parasite, living off the order her HOA had created. She presented photographs of my yard, my mailbox, even my barbecue grill, arguing each was a violation of her rules. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, some neighbors smirking as though enjoying the show. Karen turned, soaking in the attention, her face gleaming with smug triumph. Then came my turn. I stood, my hand steady as I handed the judge my folder. He flipped through the documents in silence, his brow furrowing, his lips tightening. Finally, he looked up, his voice flat and heavy as iron. "Mrs. Sanderson, this property lies outside your association's jurisdiction. It has never been subject to your authority. In fact, this deed and prior ruling make it explicitly clear your HOA has no claim here." Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Karen's face turned crimson, her mouth opening and closing like a fish grasping for air. "That can't be right," she shrieked, lunging toward the bench as though she could claw the papers from the judge's hands. "He lives here. I see his house from my window." The judge banged his gavel sharply, his voice slicing through her hysteria. "Proximity does not equal authority, Mrs. Sanderson. You have wasted this court's time, and you have harassed a homeowner who is not under your jurisdiction. This case is dismissed with prejudice." The crowd erupted again, but this time in laughter, some muffled, some open and unrestrained. Karen staggered back, her shoulders heaving, her eyes darting desperately to her board members for support. But they wouldn't meet her gaze. Her empire had cracked in 3 minutes flat, shattered by a single piece of paper she hadn't bothered to research. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse for her, the twist arrived. Councilman Reyes, who had come quietly to observe, stepped forward and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a complaint. This is not the first time Mrs. Sanderson and her board have tried to annex property outside their authority. We have multiple reports of threats and fraudulent fines against non-members. I request this be referred for investigation." The judge nodded gravely. Karen froze, her mouth agape. Suddenly, this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about years of corruption unraveling in real time. The deputies in the back of the courtroom shifted forward, ready. Karen's shrill protests filled the chamber, but the sound was drowned by the click of handcuffs closing around her wrists. And in that moment, standing there with my wife's hand in mine, I felt the weight lift not just for us, but for everyone she had tried to bully into submission. My truth had become their shield. The sound of the handcuffs locking around Karen's wrists sent a ripple through the courtroom, a sound sharper than her shrieks, more final than her threats. She twisted, her face purple with fury, jowls quivering as she screamed at the judge, at the councilman, at me. "You can't do this. I am the HOA. You'll all regret this." But her voice no longer carried weight. It carried pity, disgust, and the bitter echo of a tyrant who had overplayed her hand. The deputies led her out, her heels scraping against the marble floor, and every step was an exclamation mark at the end of her reign. The crowd spilled out of the courtroom like a dam breaking. Neighbors who had been silent victims for years gathered around me, clapping my back, shaking my hand, thanking me for standing up when no one else had dared. Maria from across the street whispered with tears in her eyes, "She fined me $200 for my daughter's tricycle on the sidewalk. I thought I was alone. You showed us we don't have to live under her rules." Even the older couple from the corner, who rarely left their house, came up to my wife and said softly, "She trespassed into our backyard last winter and threatened to cut down our tree. We were too scared to fight. You weren't." As the courthouse steps filled with voices, reporters swarmed in, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward. "Sir, how did you beat the HOA in 3 minutes?" one asked. I smiled faintly and held up the deed papers. Simple. Truth was always stronger than intimidation. She just thought no one would dare bring it into the light. But the story didn't end with her arrest. The investigation grew, wide and merciless. County officials uncovered a trail of fraudulent letters, fabricated bylaws, and thousands of dollars siphoned from the HOA treasury. Karen hadn't just bullied residents, she had built an empire of lies, using fear to extract money and compliance from people who never owed her anything. She had even tried annexing entire blocks that were never written into the HOA charter, forging signatures to make it look legitimate. For years, she had called it community maintenance. Now it had a new name, fraud. The twist came when one of her own board members flipped. Mr. Keller, a quiet man who had always sat silently at Karen's side, came forward with boxes of emails and receipts. He confessed that Karen had threatened to ruin his family if he didn't play along. His testimony turned the investigation into a full-scale fraud case, one that not only dismantled her control, but implicated several local contractors who had profited from her schemes. Karen thought she was untouchable. Instead, she had built her empire on quicksand, and now every piece of it was sinking. The community transformed almost overnight. Without Karen's iron grip, people began to breathe again. Driveways filled with chalk drawings. Flags of every color waved proudly. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to one another in years now shared coffee, laughter, and stories of survival under Karen's tyranny. We met in living rooms, not out of fear, but out of hope. A new HOA board was voted in, and for the first time, its charter was rewritten not with threats, but with fairness, transparency, and accountability. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire, I sat on my porch with my wife and Ryan. The street hummed with life, children laughing, dogs barking, neighbors sharing food across fences. It was the sound of freedom, the sound of a community healing. Ryan leaned against me and said, "All it took was one piece of paper." I shook my head. "No, son. It took courage. Courage to stand when it was easier to stay silent." Weeks later, at Karen's sentencing, the courtroom was once again filled to the brim. She shuffled in, thinner now, her eyes hollow, her arrogance replaced with bitterness. The judge's voice was steady as he read the charges: fraud, harassment, contempt of court, falsification of documents. Each word struck like a hammer. Finally, the gavel fell. 5 years in state prison, restitution to every homeowner she had wronged, and a lifetime ban from holding any HOA or civic leadership role. There was no cheering this time, just a heavy, cathartic silence as justice settled into the bones of everyone present. Karen's eyes scanned the room one last time, searching for sympathy, for loyalty, but found none. Even the board members who once clung to her now turned away. She was utterly alone. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. My wife turned to me, her voice soft but certain. You didn't just save us. You gave this whole neighborhood its life back. I thought of the papers I had carried into court, the truth I had held close for so long, and how quickly it had toppled years of tyranny. No, I said, looking at the faces of my neighbors. We gave it back to each other. She tried to divide us, but in the end, she gave us the one thing she never wanted us to have: unity. And that's the lesson that stayed with me. Power only survives in silence. Bullies thrive when good people look away. But the moment someone dares to push back, to bring truth into the open, even the most arrogant tyrant can crumble in minutes. So now I leave the question with you. Was I right to take Karen head on, to drag her lies into the light, and shut her down in front of everyone? Or should I have ignored her, hoped someone else would fight back? Tell me, is justice served, or was it too much?